Thank you very much, Dr. Steinman. And we'll end this first round with Rabbi Dr. Weinreb. He'll give his view, and then we may open it for discussion.
Thank you. Both Dr. Schoen and Dr. Steinman really touched in more technical language on some of the points I wanted to make. Particularly Dr. Schoen in cautioning us not to confuse cause and effect. Most dramatic example being the mother mouse who couldn't smell, but really wasn't guilty of rejection or infanticide. I'd like to just make a few points. Number one, just the list that you have in front of you on the program: adultery, aggression, sexual preference, spirituality, and some of the other behaviors, altruism, selfishness, and faith, that you see out there in the popular literature on behavioral genetics. All of those words are so vague and present such great difficulties of definition that they're almost useless. Aggression can mean different things in different circumstances. Behavior that's perfectly pro-social in one context, the same identical behavior can be antisocial in another context. Spirituality is impossible to define, etc. So I want to make that point. Number one, there seems to be a divide in the discussions we've had all day today between conditions which are clearly disease entities, definite pathologies, no question about it. And the ethical questions there are one set of ethical questions which perhaps are a little easier to address than the kinds of things we're speaking about here, which are not diseases. They're behaviors, and they depend upon all kinds of social contexts. They can be adaptive. They depend upon, they're culturally determined, or at least culturally modified one way or the other. The way in which you express aggression in one culture is different from the way you express it in another culture, etc. It's just like we're talking about two different kinds of topics when we spoke earlier today about Tay-Sachs or even late onset diseases of one kind or another, and the kinds of behaviors that we've been discussing this afternoon. Two other points which I think take us maybe in a little bit of a different direction. One has to do with and here again, a bit different from most of my colleagues on these panels, who are steeped or actually experts in the scientific aspects of the field. But I'm more exposed to these issues from some of the popular literature, from books like The Selfish Gene. And it seems to me that there's an agenda behind that a lot of these writers have. The agenda is the agenda of what's been called not science, but scientism. And that is an approach to the world that wants to, I look at it as a very reductionist kind of approach, which wants to reduce everything to the laboratory, and so that there's no room for anything else. There's no room for any discussions, for example, of science and religion, because science is totally comprehensive. And to do that, they sweep things like selfishness and altruism, etc., into the pile of things which can be dealt with from a purely scientific, genetic point of view. I think there's clearly an agenda there, and when you read some of these books, just before coming here, I read a book called The Faith Gene. There was very, very little in the book that showed any kind of scientific basis for a faith gene. It was all speculation, and it makes me suspect, maybe more than suspect, that there's some kind of an agenda here to be able to make science a total worldview instead of just one of our set of techniques for addressing living in the world. And then finally, this again is maybe takes us in a little bit of a different direction. In Jewish ethics, there's an old debate. It's a debate, I guess, in ethics, the history of philosophy of ethics, and that is the importance of considerations of the yachid, of the individual, and the importance of the tzibur, of the community or the society. Let's argue, for example, that we're looking at one couple, and they'd like to have a child that like to reduce or filter out or select out the aggressive gene. And one can argue that would be very nice for their little son or daughter to be non-aggressive. But then we've got to look at the total society. And in the total society as a whole, it may very well be that you can have a society where no one is aggressive. There's got to be some kind of a balance. You can't make this decision purely on an individual basis. You've got to realize that these kinds of, just looking at it from an evolutionary point of view, these kinds of behaviors that we're talking about here are all the products of evolution. They all, by the very fact that they still exist, serve some adaptive function, if not for the individual, then for the society as a whole. So for the society as a whole, you don't want everybody to be spiritual. You don't want everybody to be aggressive. You want to have that balance. And once you begin making these individual choices, you're interfering with the potential possible interests of the tzibur in the interests of what you think are the advantages for the yachid. These are just some of my reflections, and I look forward to further discussion on it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weinreb. I assume you would argue the same argument also when coming to select for high IQ and things like that. Again, it might seem like a very positive goal, but one might not necessarily appreciate what would be the general outcomes in the heterogeneity of society. Okay, so we'd like to open the stage for some questions, and maybe this will further stimulate the discussion. John?
For Rabbi Weinreb, would you care to comment on the famous Gemara that says, depending on the constellation you were born under determines your aggressiveness, and if you were born under the constellation to be a murderer, the Gemara gives you an Eitzah, that you become a Moel or a Shosh.
Obviously, in combing Talmudic literature for texts which are somehow related to the topic we're discussing with this conference, that's perhaps the most outstanding example of genetic or deterministic kinds of things. First of all, from what I've read about the aggression gene, we're not quite talking about the same kind of a thing. I don't know if you want to label that aggression or what, but whatever it is. And obviously, the Gemara doesn't attribute it to genes at all, attribute it to cosmic or cosmological influences, etc. I don't know. I have a number of reactions. Number one, it's very, very difficult to take an isolated text from the Talmud and apply it to the kinds of discussions we're having. First of all, it's part of an Agadic portion of the Talmud, and raises all the issues of what kind of significance to give to the Agada. Is it really reflecting a reality, or is it all symbolic, etc., etc.? But what clearly that passage in the Gemara is consistent to a lot of our discussion, which is all of these behavioral traits interact with a number of other major factors, environment being one, but also the individual's neshama or free will or process of choice or whatever you want to call it. But just because a person is genetically programmed to be whatever, to have 80 milliliters of aggression, whatever that means, he has all sorts of options. He or she has all sorts of options open to him in terms of his cultural context and how he's going to express it. And he has all sorts of choices, and he himself has, according to our belief system, has a mandate to be able to take something which might be negative and channel it into something positive. What's negative and what's positive is interesting, because not everybody these days would agree that being a shochet or a moral is a positive use I mean, right, shechita is being outlawed in various countries as we speak. Mila is often seen as, child abuse. These things are so culturally determined that it's very, very hard to separate out genetic tendencies from cultural behavior, from religious values. So that's just, thanks for bringing a little bit of Torah into the discussion here.